I thank you all for coming, and hopefully we can have a free-flowing conversation. And I think Colum was just talking about football right now, so I thought if we could just begin on that note, like, football as a metaphor for literature, for that matter. So, like you have all these clubs which are very local, right? Which are based in England, and yet they have fans from all over the world. And I was wondering if the phenomenon of world literature that we have, and I think today because we have that diversity amidst us, is something like that. You have literature that is written, probably inspired by very local contexts, but in some sense, have readers from all over the world. So, I mean, what, as people who really defining this phenomenon, by writing from different spaces, what would your take be on that? So.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. So, I suppose we're talking about world literature, and I only ever really think in terms of books and the book at hand and the story at hand. I never think about how it's going to necessarily translate across cultures. You just want to be as honest as possible to the story that's there, and rip it up in a certain way, and then you hope that by virtue of the story, being local, it can also become global. Because I suppose it's a job of literature to be sort of epic and tiny at the same time. So it's different to other forms in the sense that you go into a room that has been sort of swept clean by history and criticism and so on, but the fiction writer goes in and sweeps it again, and a little mote of dust comes up in the air, and you create a novel out of that little bit of dust, but you hope that it speaks to the universality of the room itself. Now, I don't know if that's BS or not, but what I do feel is that the story at hand is the most important thing.
Yeah, the connection with football is an interesting one. I mean, I've had long conversations about football with people with whom I know not one word of their language, and they know what one word of mine. But we've reenacted entire games with our little stickmen, our little finger footballers. And literature is much the same in some ways. I mean, I'm translating about 20 languages, which always surprises me, really. You think, what on earth does that country have in common with what I'm writing about? But of course, if you're writing about heartbreak and despair and joy and pain, then these things are universal. And as Colum says, these things can begin from a tiny mote, a tiny speck. And I like to set my books in a very small locale. But I like to make them epic in some way. I like to give this notion that these little tiny lives that are being lived out are of epic and global significance. And from tiny things, great things grow. Well, I say great things. That's not for me to say my books are great, although they are. That's for someone else to say.
Does this work? Okay. Well, as a PSG supporter, the French Football League. Actually, to be honest, it's not PSG I support. It is Mbappe I support, and I've become a Mbappe. So if he joins Real Madrid, I'll join Real Madrid. But I think there's the story embedded in that idea is the fascination of the human being. That also, I think, impels our own search around story as writers. At the heart of it, even if we're writing about machines, it's the exploration of the question of what does it mean to be human. And our literary explorations, the words that emerge, are born out of that question, whether it's overt or not, or what does the humanity of the other mean for me. And back to Mbappe and PSG, looking, as the characters, as the preeminent character of his generation in the world of football. He represents the idea of not just transcendence or genius in a particular form. There's a way in which he moves and acts and plays the game that is beautiful. even when he's wounded, it is beautiful. And I think there's something of the life story, the literature quest embedded in that. And I think a second allusion to your football metaphor is certainly for me as a writer and a storyteller, it has greatly surprised me that yes, the books are inspired by and moved by the Kenyan and African environment, but it strikes me, I cannot explain it, why my most enthusiastic and zealous readers are German.
Yeah, thanks for that. In fact, I was wondering if, you know, talking about world literature and, like you said, the fact that literature is about life, which is at once very local and very tiny, and yet it has an epic aspect to it. One of the things, as far as this, the proposed title of our session is concerned, and it certainly haunts discussions about literature in India, is who can write for whom, So there is this question like, if you're an Irish writer, can you write for maybe an Indian person? Can you speak his voice? If you're somebody else, and especially if the other voice is considered marginalized or underprivileged in society, there's this constant tussle whether, if a writer is in a position to even adopt that voice. Whereas on the other hand, there are people who say that, look, that is precisely the freedom literature gives you. You can assume any voice you want to, and you can play with different possibilities. And the voice of a character is just one of the variables in a story, as much as plot and character or anything else. So, of course, all of you write different things. Some of you probably identify yourself not as particular representatives of the phenomenon or the cultures you're writing about. Maybe you think that you're more inventive and you're known as a person who's known for the literature of ideas. Some other people are known more distinctively as, their identity is more tied down to their writing. So, I think different people negotiate this question in different way, but I feel today, no matter what you're writing, this is a question that somehow we must confront. So what would your response be to that?
Well, that's a fair to Yvonne.
As a bit of an iconoclast, to be honest, I don't care. My loyalty is to the story, and quite frankly, the way the story shows up in my world, it's both promiscuous and ecumenical. So a story might show up in the middle of Tokyo, and a character of Japanese origin will emerge. And because I am loyal to the story, I will write the character of Japanese origin in the way that the character has shown up. But I will also take on the responsibility of researching the milieu, the life, the environment of that culture, of the culture of the character. I will send my work, have my work dealt with by the experts and proponents and those who are inhabiting that particular culture. But I will write that character, and I will write that story, even if it is set in Kyoto. And I will not make any apologies for it. I'll let the critics and the whatnot, the rest of the world do that as I get on with my next job. My only job is to write. My only loyalty is to the story.
What she said.
It's a fascinating question, but I don't like the thought of constricting yourself to write about any one thing or from any one point of view. But as a member of the predominant white heterosexual male demographic, I would find it of supreme arrogance if I wrote from the point of view of, say, a Kenyan woman. I would leave that up to Kenyan women to write from that point of view. And Britain, as you know, as I'm sure you know, is riddled with class. And I find it so it's quite well insulting, really, and almost laughable when you get people like Martin Amis writing from the point of view of a working class white English person. It just leaps off the page. The insincerity of it leaps off the page. So I think if you're part of the powerful, the predominant demographic like I am, then I think you have to be really careful where you let your voice go, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. It has to be powerful. It has to be true. And you know, at the risk of repeating myself from earlier, those people who have been talking about cultural appropriation for the past 20, 25 years, and it started in the highest reaches of academia, actually, in the late 1990s, and now it's come to the forefront of the culture. Well, guess what? They were entirely correct. You know, writers, corporations, countries, governments have gone in places and they've patronized it and they've condescended and they've plundered and they've appropriated and they've done all these things. This is entirely true. The fact that we're talking about it now is incredibly necessary. And I shouldn't even say but, the word but, because it sounds like I'm refuting my argument. And on the same hand, there is also the notion that I want to go in somewhere and bow my head and say, I want to know. I don't know. I'm stupid. You know, cure me. You know, give me access to some other form of imagination, because otherwise we'll end up being you know, hidden in aspic and you know, so much of where we are right now is diseased with certainty. Everyone's so certain about, you know, where you are, but like somebody like Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar, philosopher, writer, talked about the necessity to be so much more than one thing. You're not just Irish, you're not just Muslim, you're not just gay, you're not just straight. You know, there's an amalgamation of all these things. And what we're really searching for, and I think what you're talking about, is achieving some form of nuance in story that doesn't come out in news and doesn't come out in the corporate culture that's going on. And whatever way you can get at that, and if you can do it with honesty and grace and style, that's the way to do it, because you've got to disrupt people. Because right now, you know, we're not as stupid as our political parties nor our media seem to want us to be. And we just are not. And it's the job of the writer to work from a reckless inner need to say, fuck this, let's go in and let's disrupt this thing and throw people off a comfortable sense of balance. That's what these people who were talking about cultural appropriation all those years ago were doing. Now people are reducing their idea down to a single sauce, and it's not. It's so much more profound than that. But the fact that this is part of our dialogue right now is fantastic.
In fact, that sort of leads me to automatically to, you know, another curiosity. When you say that it is the fiction writer who has the power to question your assumptions, to throw people off balance and, you know, infuse a critical thought in them. There's also this paradox, right? Because it's the fiction writers are today, the ones who call themselves literary, are also the ones who are absorbed in their linguistic plays and, you know, who can withdraw into, you know, a form which is not accessible, at least in India. I mean, I'm not sure if that gap exists in Ireland and Britain, which is very different from the registers which normal people speak. So while they are indeed the ones who are performing a very critical role in terms of, you know, questioning identities and, you know, asking people to think, the form they adopt is deliberately very, you know, demanding. So how do we then resolve that paradox, as you say, that it has to be engaging and speaking to society, and yet by definition it is literary, which means that it is demanding also. So how do we?
I remember a few years ago, well, before the pandemic, I did a tour across the world. Well, I say across the world. I took in 5 countries: Singapore, Australia, America, Canada, Ireland. and then back to the UK. Every one of those countries, their predominant language was English. What fascinated me, and of course they were all ex-colonies of Britain, what fascinated me was the way that each country and each region within the country used English in a different way. It was like their version of English, and now we're getting exploring this, including what they call Hinglish, H-I-N-Lish, you know. Wenglish in Wales, where I live. I mean, there's been Irish English for a long, long time, you know.
We taught the English how to speak English.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the Irish sent English out on a spree, you know. So that, I think, beats that paradox that you mentioned in some ways, because it has has the possibility of mutability in it, and it allows you to adopt many identities that are all under the same umbrella, if you know what I mean. It opens up the possibility of great exploration into various heritages and histories and cultural impulses, it seems to me.
I'm not sure if I'll be able to fully unpack your question, but I think yesterday we talked a lot about both the mutability of language, but also language itself as a vessel that is agnostic. No matter, at one point it was Latin, for example, and that nations can no longer, the idea of holding on to, kind of purist kind of English no longer belongs to just England. So in Kenya, we might say English, but it's Kenglish, and it's also ours. It's English. Our English is also a local language, as has happened everywhere else in the world, and that's power to the, it points to the incredible power of language. It's mercuriality. I think, in my opinion, I always think of language as an entity that seeks to survive no matter what it needs to do in order to survive. It will adapt to the place, adjust itself, just so that it will continue growing in whatever way it wants. And it doesn't give a damn about nationalities or boundaries or where it has come from. You were pointing to the idea of the elite and the marginalized. I think I've got to be careful about the way I say this, but quite frankly, there are a lot of presumptions about who is, who accesses the story. And I use the word story deliberately rather than literature and literary form. Story has a way of traveling and reaching people in whatever form it needs to take. It doesn't have to be the book. And certainly for a new generation, a lot of it is, Twitter, Instagram, which is pretty accessible, right? I think story will always find its way. And I think a lot of the times, in the world in which we find ourselves, there will be a new kind of framing of how and who gets access to a story they want to experience or that which they have heard about.
Yeah, and I think the key word here is story. Politics, a writer's politics is actually quite boring. In fact, I'd really prefer for a writer to stay out of his, her, or their politics, except to create a story in which I can interpret some sort of politics that emerges from it. And I think that's really where some of the beauty of the poetry comes in, of being a poet or of being a fiction writer, is that you don't have to make declarative things about nation or language or all the... in fact, the whole Joyce thing about, what is a nation? And Bloom says, a nation is the same people living in the same place. And the citizen who's drunk in the pub says, if that's so, I'm a nation, for I've been living in the same place for the past 5 years. And then they say, but also living in different places. And so this is part of the complexity of all of this. But I think that as writers, we're lucky because we can get in and kick down some of the simple doors of understanding and make it, I don't know, I like doubt. I like not knowing. I like also being able to say, I don't actually know what it is that I'm doing sometimes. I actually don't even know what I'm writing about sometimes, but I feel it. You feel it in your gut. You feel it, and then it seems to be right. And when I read a great book, it seems to be right, but it's not declaring itself nor its principles, nor wearing its heart on its sleeve. And I think that's one of the interesting things about a writer's politics, that she or he can get at it by not getting at it.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, is that there is an assumption that writing is a cerebral thing. It comes from the head. I don't think it does. It comes from the heart and the lungs and the blood and the sex organs and everything else, you know. And we all know how susceptible emotion is to influence. But as Colum says, there's it's a non-fixed stance, you know. The great Yeats line, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, you know. I mean, we're seeing that now. It's the ones who know they're right are the most dangerous people on earth. And I think writing allows us to be on the right side. Say, I don't know exactly.
So before I ask, I just want to confess something before I move on to the next question. You guys probably think that I haven't read your books, and it's true for most of the sessions, right? I actually believe that most moderators here have not read your books, but it just somehow happens that I have read your books many years back. And when I saw your name, I was just not ready to believe that you are actually that person. So when you actually came from here, I was very surprised that it is the same Colum McCann, you know. So I discovered your books like around in the year 2008 or 9, something like that. And, in the American Library in Angers, France. So I'm quite, so this relates to the point about literary fiction, right? So a very person who writes very great literary fiction can be just walking amongst you, as if he's just the next person, So just wanted to make that note. So I have in this panel, at least a moderator has read at least one of your books. So, but that brings me to the very interesting point that you were making about Joyce, because I was actually thinking about it, and because it relates to a peculiar problem, at least we in India face, that, so, this whole idea that when you are truly immersed and embedded in your linguistic culture, you organically use that language to write novels, to write philosophy, to, produce intellect. So it's a bit like saying that, Joyce can be very Irish and very rooted and yet be very profoundly philosophical. Now I can tell you that that's just not the condition I can start from, because all that I have read, which is philosophical, which is about the world of ideas or, great literature, is all English. But that's not my linguistic milieu, So, and there's this, some people say that's productive because, I have many worlds to access from. But some other people say that that's how many of the post-colonial countries are losing the sense of an inherent philosophy or an inherent worldview that exists within their language, which you can draw out, So for example, how maybe Heidegger talks about, there's a relationship between German language and its philosophy, it flows out of the language, right? So, I don't know if you have experienced that being, a Kenyan writer, what I'm talking about, like the very fact that maybe you're writing in English, but inherently, there is so much within you that is not happening in English. So how do you sort of, negotiate that? So
to be Kenyan is to be plural. So when the moment I'm born as a Kenyan, I am living at a minimum, this is minimum, with 3 languages. I'm born into 3 languages the moment I'm born in Kenya, and some have access to even 7 the moment they're born. So the coexistence of multiple streams of language, of philosophies, of imaging, of ideation is absolutely normal. When I'm being mean to an East African, it's a typical also East African situation, I say we are shapeshifters. The Yvonne you meet here is not necessarily the Yvonne you meet in Nairobi, nor is it the same Yvonne you're going to meet when I go to my ancestral home. But they're all one Yvonne, but they're multiple selves. So we're comfortable in our pluralities, and I think that's an aspect, a feature of most of the so-called global South. The compatibility with our plural selves, the pluriversality of our being. And I think then that's the contrast with the Occidental worlds that were into this homogenization, so that most of the nation states in Europe are tribal states. The German, the Italian, and the language groups are very particular. So I imagine then that the formation of worlds that inform the identities we inhabit come into play. So that which you're talking about, yes, there have been losses, and there definitely have been. I'm not denying that. But on the other hand, there are the opportunities of the crevices, the in-betweens, the conflict and encounters, the dramatic encounters of different language worlds that offer, I think, certainly for a lot of us, and certainly from a lot of the global South, something refreshing. So there's always something refreshing. And so when English comes into that space as well, it's just another of the languages in that particular milieu, both internal and external.
I have to say, it's exciting to be up here, because we can. I'm anticipating all these answers, and there's so much to talk about. Look, Ireland and India, we have a lot to learn from one another. Certainly as post-colonial nations, and certainly in terms of literature. When I was growing up in Dublin in the 60s and the 70s, primarily in the 70s in Ireland, there was not a single statue of James Joyce in Dublin. There was no pub called the James Joyce Inn. There was no, there was no iconography around. They knocked down 7 Eccles Street. They didn't give a damn. It's only in recent years, now you go to Dublin and we've embraced it. It's almost like we were scared, we were embarrassed by our literature for a long time. I wasn't allowed to read Joyce in school. We had to read Maupassant, and we had to read English writers, and there was that post-colonial embarrassment that we had to grow out of. Who does that come from? Well, it comes from all of you, and it'll come from a fighting spirit that needs to say that this literature is important. I have a feeling that Irish independence came before Indian independence, but that something magnificent is going to swell up here. And in the same way that Irish literature got a huge kick in the 1990s, and then has become very strong and prominent in all sorts of ways, including our ability to look back and rediscover the Joyces and the Flann O'Briens and so on, that something like that will possibly, if not probably, happen in India. But it's your responsibility as professors or readers or writers or cultural commentators to do that. Like, for example, I think of Arundhati Roy and reading her for the first time and having my soul kicked over the fence in the most glorious way, and the recognition of that sort of power and the activism that's going on there. I think, I mean, I can't say it for certain, but I do feel that something truly profound will happen within Indian literature and the identity of this area within the next decade or a couple of decades. But who am I to say?
Colum, I'm curious, is this your first time in Kerala?
Yeah, my first time in Kerala.
I see. That explains it. a hell of a lot has been happening in Indian literature for a long, long time.
No.
Certainly, you know, the great influences of people like Rabindranath Tagore, I adore that man, that infuses and informs even the works of our world. Salman Rushdie, not just Arundhati Roy, and
Amit
the great
Chowdhury,
thinkers, Pankaj Mishra. So that thing, quite frankly, the thing that happened within Indian literature, the great burgeoning and flowering preceded the great burgeoning and flowering around the literatures of Africa. That thing has happened, but what I'm most curious about, actually, to our moderator, is what's next, given the whole kind of fourth industrial revolution thing. Where is that literature going? Is it how is it go? What is going to turn into? Is it virtual? Does it go virtual and everything? But quite frankly, the most vital literatures of the world right now are the literatures of Asia, Africa, South America. Yeah, just thought I should point that out.
Yeah, I brought with me a collection of stories by Manto, which I bought when I was last in India about 10 years ago. I've only got around to reading it now. But you're discovering a writer like him. I know he wrote primarily about partition, but he also wrote about the underworld and the underclass, which I never thought existed in modern-ish in Indian literature. I think there's a great groundswell happening, and there's a lot of waves waiting to break, I think, as there was in Ireland. Wales, of course, is a land of two languages, very, very much so. More people speak English than speak Welsh, but Welsh is doing okay in relation to other Celtic languages. It's getting better, partly because it's become quite a cool thing to do amongst youngsters. You know, they've got a secret language that their parents don't speak, so it's become it has that cachet now and that imprimatur, which is making things very, very interesting. But I think, I don't read much Welsh at all. My Welsh is very bad. So I think, and a lot of Welsh writers don't want to be translated. I understand that, say, well, if you want to know what I'm writing about, learn the language. I understand that. And understand the necessity of doing that. So I'm waiting for the time when they won't mind being translated, because it will be this huge addition to the literature that Wales has produced, which has always produced good literature. Dylan Thomas, of course, and Ireland has always been, in my opinion, the kingmaker of literary greats. It seems to me. But in terms of this, links back to your question. When I was a kid, if I was sent to the shop for bread by my Welsh granny, she'd say, "Go and get some bara." My Irish granny would say, "Go and get some aran." English-speaking relatives would say, "Go and get some bread." So bread was always three things to me. Something as basic as bread had three identities in my head, you see. And then the older I got and the more I started dabbling with other Celtic languages, Irish has the same construction as well, I think. In Welsh, you wouldn't say, "I'm thirsty." You'd say, "There is a thirst on me," which I really like. It means that the I, the supreme I, is taken out of the equation. The I is something that happens to you, And I find that really quite a lovely way of looking at the world.
Just going to say that's very poignant and linked to the idea of the bread with multiple identities, but very and then I was listening to the cadence of your speaking, and I realized there are 4 Englishes happening right here. There are 4 dialects of English happening right here, and I think sometimes the wonder that turns us into riddles, it turns us, questing, is literally right before us. So.
Because, one of the questions which, in fact, I wanted to ask in the previous session, but I didn't have the time. And I thought this is quite an opportune moment to just get it out of the way from me. people like you who have pursued a career in writing have tried your best to, come up with your own voice. How did you see this idea of originality, as you grew up? Because I just want to tell you how my ideas changed. Initially, I used to think that the only original fiction had to be a literature of ideas. So I would just feel that all novels which are about real people or, everything are all repeatable things, reproducible easily, purely incidental novels. I would just try to find out who is the next Borges or, stuff like that. Of course, I grew out of it. Now I see what it means to innovate in fiction apart from innovating in a fiction of ideas. So every writer, and I'm sure all of you, have a sense of what it means to be original, I mean, it is a very personal thing, where you decide whether it's a style, whether it is the issue you pick up. There's a very unique sense because of what it means to be original, because that is, after all, what drives us. I mean, unless, of course, you do a Mills and Boon or something like that, which is deliberately cookie cutter. So what is your idea of originality? Like, how do you see it?
I would see it like if I picked up dust, for instance, I would see it in the music as it looks on the page. For me, it's all about rhythm. I find plot to be generally quite juvenile and uninteresting, but everything is about language, and then character comes out of language, and then plot comes out of character. And so for me, I think I would agree that this, these books of ideas are not as interesting as these books of characters who come out of like some of the strangest little places. But ultimately, for me, it's about the sound of it, the rhythm of it, and the way it makes a music in the reader's head.
Yes, I would agree. The poetry of prose, Joyce, to get back to James Joyce, he did this exceptionally well. I think I find myself, I'm not happy unless I'm trying to do something new with form and voice and structure. It always seems to be this insistence inside me that I need to do something new with those things, And I find that interesting. I find that really, really fascinating. And I think, I don't want to kind of self-aggrandize here, but I think that's of utmost importance for writing today. I mean, the way media and politicians are warping language so that really there is no objective reality anymore. Reality is a negotiable truth. Is an awful paradox, but it's the way people are using it. And I think this is going to get worse and worse and worse. And that's what really worries me. And yet at the same time, the world continues to be beautiful. It can't help it, despite what we've done to it and what we are doing to it and we are going to do to it. The world and everything in it continues to be, well, most things in it, continues to be somehow awe-inspiring. And I think that is, I don't quite know how it links with what I've just said about voice and structure. But again, this gets us back to the ineffable, indefatigable feeling of writing coming from the heart and the lungs and the blood vessels. I can't put any better than that, really.
Thank you for what you guys have said. Yes, absolutely. Rhythm, sound, the music from the text and of the text. I would want to add a confluence of all those elements we've heard about: story, style, plot. Something happens when they all come together in this melange, and in this pot, in this cauldron, and into that cauldron you put in the questions, the things that keep you up at night. I think the questions you have about life, the cosmos, the human being. What does it mean to be human in this particular time, for example? And it's a brew, something that happens, all these little elements you throw in. The influence of the ghosts, and the shadows that inform our living, the silences, the things we don't want to talk about that enter into this as almost like a secret and a subterranean stream. Like everything then comes together, and then you have this magical presence emerges, the thing called the story. And sometimes it changes lives, sometimes it doesn't, but something emerges. I'm always in awe of the mystery of it. And I'm not being woo-hoo about it, but I'm in awe of what shows up when I take myself to the desk. And most of the time, I do not know who and what is coming around the corner, and which word it's carrying with it. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add one little thing to that, I do quite a lot of teaching of writing, and I really don't like the kind of precious thing that people can say sometimes. I get up in the morning, turn on my laptop to see what my characters have done overnight. I find that so precious, and it makes me cringe. But at the same time, though, I do like when my characters surprise themselves. And also, you know what's coming around the corner. Sometimes I find characters from my other books coming into my books.
Yeah.
You know, they just have a walk on past, think, oh, it's him or it's her. I wonder what they've been doing the past 10 years since I wrote about them. So they do take. I'm self-conscious about this. You know, I know what I'm doing. But yeah, the kind of mystery of it, and the life that they take, the autonomy that they take on themselves. Speaks to some hidden part of my own mind that I suspect might be quite a nice part, and I quite like it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I can sort of paraphrase what you're saying, is that the key to originality lies in authenticity. If you're authentic, then you can sort of bet on the fact that maybe you'll end up being original, as much as you can. And, one of the things that, and especially I think I understand when Colum is saying about the music on the page. But there's still a challenge there. The reason I say that is because on one hand, we can be very Puritan about the fact that as a writer of literary fiction, we are carrying forward this history of literary language, and we are withdrawn from how language is actually used today. But at the same time, we can't divorce ourselves from the reality that people are using chat lingo or social media, emoticons, and there's a way in which the rhythms, the music of language of the people is constantly changing. And I don't know how people within literary fiction, the people who really write well, people like you, how one way is to keep yourself isolated, that look, I won't let that noise affect my imagination. The other way is to appropriate those new rhythms, and see what new possibilities could be there, it might be appearing very populist, okay, how is WhatsApp changing our language? But maybe there's something interesting even in that, something profound. So how do you, is that something that bothers you? Because definitely for me, when I did a little bit of my own writing, for me writing seemed to be a withdrawal. So for me it was like going back to Kafka and Borges and just trying to see if I can write those stories again. Whereas, so it was more like withdrawing from the music, the rhythms of, what people are actually talking today. So I don't know, like.
Well, I'm working on something right now, and it takes place in 2021, 2022, and suddenly a character was talking about an emoji in an email. I was like, shit, I don't want any emojis to be popping up on the page. What do I do here? There's that anxiety that it mightn't work, but there has to be a way to incorporate it, because the novel is a shifting, changing form. The last book I did, it was deliberately fractured and had this sort of echo of the internet. It's called a paragon, and it was sort of meant to be read in all these fractures and to come out and come back in again, come out, come back in again, and you just you take the world as it is in front of you and you try to shape it, and somebody will come along. It probably has already been done in extraordinary ways, and write the great internet novel, or even do a novel full of emojis, or a short story full of emojis. I still don't understand those things. You know, when that little fella comes on and he's got a smile on his face and he's crying tears. What does that mean? I mean, seriously, what does it mean? And who comes up with these emojis? Maybe that's the story. Who is the emoji maker?
You know, I'm these things, the kind of the contemporary space, the languaging of the space, the whole generation growing up not with English necessarily as much as the language of code, which is a universal language right now, the programming languages. It will show up when it's time. The muse will adopt whatever shape it needs to take and show up in somebody's story. It's just a matter of time. Hopefully I won't be the one chosen. You might actually, or you, but and maybe you'll come up with a great Twitter novel. But I hope it doesn't happen to me. But if it does happen to me, then I will. I told you, as I said in the beginning, I'm loyal to story. If that's a story that shows up, that's a story I will write.
In my more hopeful moments, I think the language of emojis is can be just as rich as any other mode of expression, really. I remember when the aubergine eggplant emoji first appeared, and I was thinking, what on earth, why would you use an eggplant emoji? And then I saw it in the context in which it is meant, and I thought, oh, I see, that's what it means. But part of me was thinking, why not use something that was more obviously phallic, like a carrot or a banana? But then I thought, well, actually, it's quite clever to use an emoji, an aubergine as that. And it did kind of spark off my mind at sort of, thinking about aubergines and sexuality and all these kind of strange links. And it did actually remind me of when I was a kid, and the first words that excited my imagination were slang words. There was no books in the house, there was no sort of C pronunciation in the house, really. It was all slang and working class speech, with some wonderful, wonderful similes. And then a nursery rhyme. Ride a cock horse to Banbury Cross, thinking, what on earth's a cock horse? Where is Banbury Cross? And why should I ride a cock horse there? All this kind of stuff. And then when I started to study and read, say, John Donne, Go and Catch a Falling Star, Get with Child a Mandrake Root, that was just as thrilling for me as the Banbury Cross was. So actually, now I've said this, I'm convincing myself that the importance I'm putting on the language of emojis is completely false. Forget everything I've just said.
I'll never look at a dish of eggplant parmesan in the same way.